Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Koldar here. Today, we have the heroic commentary guide for Amber Shaper Unsok in Art of Fear. So this guy is pretty painful. I think he took us around 80 attempts, I want to say, something like that. So definitely one of the more challenging heroics that we've seen so far this tier. Although most of that is really just trying out different strategies and determining, hey, this doesn't work at all, we better try something else. So it's kind of a cool fight, but there are a number of ways you can go about doing it. And I'll talk about sort of a few of those options, as well as, of course, focus primarily on what it is that we do, which is probably the standard strategy these days. Pretty much what everybody does is the same. So let's get started. So first up, the number of new abilities or altered mechanics between heroic and normal are few and far between, but those differences that do exist are fairly dramatic and they drastically impact the encounter. So the most important change introduced in heroic difficulty deals with the amber spawns. As with normal difficulty, living ambers spawn 4 at a time from the Amber Shaper's Amber Scalpel attack, which is of course cast every 50 seconds on a random raid member. And like normal difficulty, living ambers on heroic can be killed, and upon death, they create an amber pool at their location, which can be consumed by a constructed player at any time. However, the key factor is that on heroic, once an amber pool has been active for 30 seconds, it will reconstitute itself into the previous living amber form, thus soaking and destroying the pool and recreating a living amber to once again attack the raid. Therefore, the single mechanical change dramatically impacts the manner in which the raid must handle living amber spawns and the amber pools created therein, as any pools not consumed rapidly by a currently constructed player will quickly reform and be a threat to the raid once again. With the addition of 4 new living amber every 50 seconds from Amber Scalpel, the raid can very swiftly become overwhelmed by living amber duties if a sound amber management strategy is not implemented throughout the encounter. Regardless of the specific strategy that you elect to implement for heroic Amber Shaper, inevitably all methods revolve around the singular notion of managing energy for the constructed players throughout the fight. Therefore, it's worth taking a moment to go over the numerics behind construct energy and how they affect the timing and potential strategies your raid can utilize during the encounter. First and foremost, a construct loses energy automatically at a rate of 2 energy per second. Additionally, all constructs should utilize the Struggle for Control ability every 13 seconds to self-interrupt their Amber Explosion cast, consuming an additional 8 energy. So therefore, we can figure out the baseline energy loss for a construct as the following calculation. So 2 energy per second plus 8 energy every 13 seconds equals 34 energy every 13 seconds, or the average of 2.62 energy per second consumed. A newly spawned construct that starts with 100 energy will therefore have a baseline lifespan of 100 energy over 2.6 energy per second, or 38.2 seconds of lifespan. So, of course, this means that any constructed player that does not consume any amber pools will be alive for a maximum of 38 seconds before he or she is forced to leave. When an amber pool is consumed, this gives the construct up to 20 additional energy, without, of course, exceeding the total 100 energy max. And given our current energy usage rate of 2.62 energy per second, this means each amber pool consumed adds an extra lifespan from this calculation. 20 energy at 2.62 a second equals 7.6 seconds of extra lifespan per pool consumed. Now, this extra time given for each amber pool is not exact and varies slightly based on whether the construct must interrupt his or her amber explosion during this period, thereby consuming an extra 8 energy. However, the average time added per pool of 7.6 seconds is accurate over the course of the encounter, and can be useful knowledge in certain events, such as when a single constructed player needs to interrupt the Amber Monstrosity's Amber explosion within the next few seconds, and the construct energy total is so low that it will force the player to leave before that interrupt occurs. So consuming a single puddle for an extra 7 seconds or so of time may be enough to allow you to actually interrupt the Amber Monstrosity's cast and save the raid from wiping. Since each Amber pool consumed adds 7.6 seconds of lifespan, and there are 4 potential pools created every 50 seconds from living Amber spawns via Amber Scalpel, this provides a useful bit of information. Since a new construct is created every 50 seconds via Reshape Life, and that construct starts at 100 energy, if the constructed player consumes all 4 Amber pools while below 80 energy, his or her total lifespan will become 68.2 seconds, as seen in this calculation. Therefore, if desired, each new constructed player can easily remain active for the entire 50-second duration of that Reshape Life Amber Scalpel round, with 18 seconds of overlap until the next construct is created. Now on the flip side, what happens if new constructs created via Reshape Life are ignored, and instead only one specific constructed player is allowed to consume the Amber pools? Well, we can figure out the lifespan quite easily, remembering that the first 100 starting energy provides 38.2 seconds of lifespan, and consuming 4 pools adds another 30.4 seconds, putting their lifespan well into the second Amber Scalpel cast, and therefore the second set of 4 living Amber pools, for a total of 8 pools or 60.8 seconds added to the baseline lifespan. So you can see here, the calculation for consuming 8 pools plus the baseline comes out to 99 seconds of total lifespan. This means that, sad as it may seem, a single construct consuming only living Amber spawns as they appear will drain their energy at a rate faster than it can be generated via consumed solely from the sets of 4 generated living Amber from Amber Scalpel every 50 seconds. They just can't do it fast enough. In fact, the construct will run out of energy right as the third Amber Scalpel cast is being completed, but remember it takes a while for living Amber spawns to both appear and be killed, and thus they cannot be consumed instantly to retain this particular construct any longer. Even if the constructed player could manage to instantly destroy the living Ambers and consume the fresh set of 4 Amber pools in this third set, again, due to the rate of energy consumption, his or her lifespan would be dramatically short compared to when the next Amber Scalpel cast was due. So see here, if we bump it up to 12 pools consumed plus the original starting 100 energy lifespan, the total is 129.4 seconds. And this means the constructed player would run out of energy 29.4 seconds into the current Reshape Life round, which is still a good 17 or 18 seconds ahead of the next Amber Scalpel cast. So, knowing all the details behind construct energy usage allows one to put that knowledge into practice in a few different strategies for this encounter. Now, the next big factor to consider when strategizing for this encounter is the mechanics and usage of Amber Strike, the primary or number 1 ability used by constructed players throughout the fight. Just like normal difficulty, this ability can be used on any target every 6 seconds, and in addition to dealing a large chunk of damage, about 350,000 nature damage, it will most importantly apply the stacking Destabilize debuff. Now, of course, Destabilize lasts 15 seconds and increases the damage taken by the target by 10% per stack, stacking near infinitely. The point of vital importance for Heroic Amber Shaper is that Amber Strike can be utilized on Unsock himself during Phase 2 of the encounter, even when the boss is immune to damage. While the damage component of Amber Strike will fail to do anything during this period, the Destabilize debuff will still connect and stack up on Amber Shaper Unsock while he is immune. This is the sole driving factor behind the vast majority of heroic strategies used in this encounter to date, and ours is no exception. The reason this tactic is important is due to the very harsh mechanics of Phase 3, allowing the raid to enter the final third phase with a pre-existing stack of the Destabilize debuff on Unsock, and therefore deal obscene amounts of DPS to the boss well before you'd normally be able to do it under regular circumstances. The reasons for the difficulty of the third phase will be covered in that section, but suffice to say most strategies will want to utilize some form of pre-stacking Destabilize on Unsock prior to the start of Phase 3 for this very purpose. Since the crucial aspects of this encounter almost entirely revolve around proper control of construct abilities and energy, there are a handful of tips and best practices that can prevent some headaches when put into use. First and foremost, nearly without exception, all actions of a constructed player should be done with the mindset of working around the 6-second cooldown of Amber Strike. Every moment the constructed player should be considering how soon Amber Strike will come off cooldown and plan ahead to be in position of his or her primary Amber Strike target at that moment. Regardless of the strategy employed by the raid, the more judiciously Amber Strike is used on cooldown, the better chance that Destabilize will remain active on the intended targets during the encounter. Not only is this incredibly important for DPS purposes, but in most strategies, maintaining Destabilize properly is required, and failing to do so requires a purposeful wipe for the raid. Therefore, the best practice for constructed players is to deal with non-Amber Strike tasks in the interim 4 or 5 seconds of downtime between Amber Strike cooldowns. This includes movement away from and back into melee range of the primary target, as well as Amber Pool consumption. The self-interrupts via struggle for control cannot be intentionally timed in most cases, so performing an interrupt takes precedence over exact on-cooldown Amber Strike usage, but everything else should be revolving around this ability being utilized at every opportunity. Now second, if a construct is consuming Amber Pools, regardless of the number that are being consumed, it's best to have the player do all this consumption early in his or her constructed phase rather than later. This will benefit DPS players who are attempting to bring the construct's health below the escape level of 20%, because if you consider that every Amber Pool consumed increases the current and max health of the construct by 2 million hit points, if the constructed player consumes a pool while at, say, 15% health, this will invariably push the health above 20% once again, and force DPS to re-engage the construct to drop it back below 20. As with any DPS scenario, target swapping is a dramatic overall DPS loss, so avoiding this is crucial. Instead, as long as the construct is at or below 80 energy, if a pool is meant to be consumed by the controlling player, he or she should attempt to do so as rapidly as possible, again without compromising proper on-cooldown use of Amber Strike. This is usually done by performing a simple rotation. So first, Amber Strike. If energy is at or below 80, move to the furthest pool and consume it. Move back into melee range of the primary target, and then Amber Strike again, and just repeat the second through fourth steps over and over. The only exception to using Amber Strike on cooldown is of course for constructed players during Phase 2 who are meant to interrupt the Amber Explosion from the Amber Monstrosity. This ability is cast every 47 seconds, so one interrupt is required for each Reshape Life round during Phase 2. The cooldown is quite precise, so constructed players should keep a very close eye on the timer for the upcoming Monstrosity's Amber Explosion, since players should be using Amber Strike on cooldown at all times except for this scenario. A simple system should be used to ensure Amber Strike is still utilized as frequently as possible while ensuring availability to interrupt the Monstrosity. So first, when the cooldown for the Monstrosity's Amber Explosion has greater than 12 seconds remaining, Amber Strike as you normally would on cooldown, just to do it as often as possible. Second, if the Monstrosity's Amber Explosion has between 7 and 12 seconds remaining, Amber Strike one more time somewhere within that time frame, in that time span. And then finally, of course, when he does Amber Explosion, interrupt him and you'll be good. Now, by performing one final Amber Strike between that 7 and 12 second window, and then halting the use, Until you interrupt, the constructed player can be assured that Destabilize will remain stacked on the Monstrosity while also managing the cooldown, so Amber Strike is always available when the interrupt is required. Finally, albeit rare, occasionally the Monstrosity's Amber Explosion and the personal construct Amber Explosion will sometimes occur simultaneously, and this can often be a point of confusion for players about what to do. The basic rule is simple: react to whichever explosion presented itself first. Now, if they're truly simultaneous, and one of them did not happen first, then you should utilize Struggle for Control first to interrupt yourself, and then Amber Strike second to interrupt the Monstrosity. While the Monstrosity's explosion is far more dangerous than the personal explosion from a construct, it seems that using Amber Strike and then Struggle for Control can sometimes cause Struggle to fail and not register properly. While if you flip it around, the order always seems to work. And in spite of the slight stun that Struggle for Control applies, you can still properly get Amber Strike off, since the Amber Explosion has a 2.5 second cooldown, or cast time. Now, depending on the strategy your raid is using, you may find it necessary to ensure Unsock is as low health as possible when he enters Phase 3. Usually this is around 65%, as mentioned before, but this value can be lowered a good chunk by taking advantage of a simple fact. Unsock will not cast the spell to summon the Monstrosity and start Phase 2 while he is in the middle of channeling another spell, such as Amber Scalpel or Reshape Life. Therefore, if timed properly, the raid can halt damage on Amber Shaper Unsock just above 70% and wait for him to cast Amber Scalpel and begin to burn him down. Amber Scalpel is a 10-second cast and is always immediately followed by Reshape Life, which is another 2.5-second cast. This gives your raid a good 13 to 14 seconds of DPS time to attack Unsock below 70% before he gains immunity entering Phase 2. Depending on the Destabilize stack at the time, you can get his health very low during this period, giving you a major leg up when going into Phase 3. Parasitic Growth only deals slightly more damage on Heroic than on Normal. It's about 30,000 every 2 seconds compared to 25,000 on Normal. However, given that the other damage values are increased on Heroic, managing this ability can be a little bit tricky sometimes. The absolute best way to handle Parasitic Growth is with Absorbs. Absorb abilities do not seem to count toward the healing received portion of the debuff, and therefore don't increase the tick damage when they absorb damage dealt to the player. So, as with any such mechanic, early reductions are key. So players should use self-cooldowns if they get this debuff, especially if unavoidable damage is expected, like the living ambers are active and ticking on you, or one of them's about to die near you and explode, or stomp damage is occurring, that kind of thing. Now, while they are not the primary difficulty of the third phase, Amber Globules are the most basic addition to this phase on Heroic difficulty, and they do increase the challenge and lower raid DPS by a decent chunk. So every 33 seconds during Phase 3, a pair of Amber Globules will spawn, one each from a random corner of the room where the very large static amber pools reside. Each globule fixates on a random player upon spawning, and it cannot be attacked, snared, stunned, or controlled in any way. If the globule reaches melee range of the targeted player, it will explode and deal 600,000 nature damage to the entire raid, easily wiping you. However, the Amber Globules move at a very slow pace, and if any two globules cross into melee range of one another, they will harmlessly dissipate and despawn. Since the 4 spawning pools in each of the corners are equidistant to the center of the room, there's a simple scheme that might come to your mind by which players could force globules to pass through one another and despawn. If you're viewing the room from above, all players can be stacked in the center of the room during Phase 3. Prior to the fight, 4 raid markers should be placed at the corners of the square stairway around the middle of the room that surrounds it. During the third phase, once 2 players are selected by globules, Each player could theoretically move to the raid marked point that is opposite the origination point of his or her pursuing globule. If they do so, the travel paths of each globule will look like this image here. Now, the player pursued by globule from corner B moved opposite to the blue marker, and the player chased by globule A moved to the purple marker. Unfortunately, there's one small kink in this method. Globules do not spawn at the exact same moment, but instead they spawn about 2 to 3 seconds apart. This means, in the above example, the globule from B is going along the blue line, and it was the first to spawn, and thus it traveled the equal distance from the spawn to the central crossover point at the same speed as globule A, but since it spawned first, it arrives before globule A, and thus they do not cross over at the same moment, and they don't despawn either. So, to resolve this issue of spawn timings, we must adjust the travel lengths for each globule before reaching the designated crossover point. So in our original image, the imaginary line between corner A and corner B, or the segment AB, is a static length, with the other segment from A to crossover point C, segment AC, and the segment from B to crossover point C, BC, being equal length to one another. So AC and BC are equal since the segment AB is always the same length. So from trigonometry, we know that this triangle with a static length for AB means as we move our crossover point closer to one of the points A or B, the length of the segment nearest to that point gets shorter, while the other segment gets longer. Therefore, now we change our setup as so. So, as we move the crossover point, now at the green raid marker, closer to point A, the segment AC becomes shorter while the segment BC becomes longer. Since the globule from point B was the first spawn, we want it to travel the longer distance of the two globules. Thus, we adjust our crossover point C to be around the raid marker near point A, where the second spawn globule appears. This can be accomplished easily by forcing the player that has the first spawn globule, from point B along the blue line in this case, to move to the close raid marker corner where the second spawn globule originated, while the player targeted by globule A remains in the center of the room and thus is able to keep attacking Unsock. In all cases, the player that was first selected by the globule, which is going to be the first name listed in your chat log, should be the player to move out of the central position. Now with that said, especially in the heat of battle, it can sometimes be difficult to properly gauge which of the two globules was the first to spawn. Your raid should do its best to visually see which globule is the farthest away while remaining in the central position. Once the far globule is confirmed, the first selected player can move out to the marker nearest to that globule. Obviously, the player should not stand directly on the marker in question, which is intended as the crossover point, but instead a few yards behind it and the opposite direction of their pursuing globule. However, in spite of this system, sometimes a guess about which globule is the furthest away will be incorrect, and this will cause the globule paths and positions to look like this. So you can see here, this means while that our first selected player moved out of the green marker location, the globule from point B is still clearly moving toward the center position, which immediately indicates that the globule from B is actually the second spawned globule, and therefore our first selected player should quickly move over to the red marker nearest to point B to remedy the situation. The good news is that since paths were kept straight until this point, very little is lost in this transition mistake, and only slight adjustments may be necessary to force the globules to cross. While the amber globules are the only direct addition to heroic difficulty for Amber Shaper Unsock, another major factor in Phase 3 is the basic DPS requirement for the raid. Consider that Amber Shaper starts to enter Phase 2 at 70%. If no other methods are used to delay his immunity gains, and more on this later, he'll likely become immune and enter Phase 2 around 65% health, which is around 221 million hit points. If Phase 3 on Heroic is treated like Phase 3 on Normal, and there aren't any Amber pools stockpiled to utilize, we can determine fairly easily how long it will take a raid with any given raid DPS to kill Unsock during Phase 3 using the spreadsheet I've included in the description for this video. Now, while an actual formula to figure this out is far beyond my math skills, the spreadsheet does the job fairly simply. So in the baseline example, with a rate of 650,000 DPS, if Unsock has no destabilized stacks entering the phase, it will take approximately 2 minutes 15 seconds to kill Unsock. This is a generous assumption of DPS, however, given that almost constantly there will be globules that must be managed in addition to the excessive healing that will be required. It also assumes the maximum destabilized stacking of 6 per constructed player during this final phase. Remember that Reshape life is cast every 15 seconds during Phase 3. Further, we're assuming a constructed player is dealing the appropriate DPS average even while they're a construct, which in most cases is just not true. Baseline construct DPS is 118,333 if the Amber Strike is used on cooldown and the target is always within melee range, which it should be in this final phase. However, 118,000 DPS is about 30% or so higher than what a normal DPS player would deal in a raid that does 650,000 DPS, since generally DPS players deal around 13% of the raid DPS, assuming 2 healers, 2 tanks. So this assumption in the calculation is probably a reasonable balance to counteract the issue with dealing with globules, since the globules don't chase players that are constructed. While it's theoretically viable to treat this like normal difficulty and not plan ahead for Phase 3 to meet this high DPS requirement, it's highly unadvisable. Over 2 minutes is a very long time to spend in Phase 3, and many issues will arise. For one, due to the incredibly high damage dealt to non-construct players, targets of the Parasitic Growth debuff during this phase are very likely to die prematurely because there's simply too much healing requirement going on that can't be selectively controlled. So eventually the debuff will deal too much damage and the player is likely to die even with cooldowns. In addition, without planning ahead and saving living ambers specifically for this final phase, the constructed players will invariably die after the 38-second lifespan, dropping the raid numbers pretty rapidly. Now this first strategy, which we can just refer to as consuming all amber and destabilizing Unsock, is certainly the most basic strategy for Heroic, and therefore starting out with this method, or some form of it, will prove the easiest stepping stone to get deep into the fight and really start to learn the mechanics. Now the basic idea is simple. The raid destroys every set of 4 living amber as it spawns and allows the new construct that was created from the most recent Reshape life to consume all 4 pools. Meanwhile, regardless of the phase that's active, the constructed player should focus all Amber Strike attacks on Amber Shaper Unsock. So the pros for this are a couple. The big advantage to this strategy is that this method is very easy to perform. Killing living amber as they appear without concern for the timing of that, and consuming the pools as well, is very simple and straightforward. Similarly, completely ignoring construct energy mechanics means that the raid never has need to worry about how well a construct manages his or her energy or abilities, so long as Destabilize is maintained on Unsock and the DPS ensure that each construct is pushed below 20% at some point. Another key factor for this method is that it allows the raid to enter Phase 3 with a very high Destabilize stack on Unsock. If Destabilize is maintained throughout the fight, he will fall over so fast that the mechanics and the healing requirements for Phase 3 will be completely irrelevant to the raid. Now, the downside to this method is that Phase 2 will be very long and requires a huge amount of DPS to meet the Berserk timer. So again, it's a good way to practice things, but not necessarily something you might settle on as your final strategy. Now, depending, of course, on raid DPS, it's a safe bet that the raid will enter Phase 2 with about 6 minutes remaining on Berserk. Additionally, with high Destabilized stacks on Unsock, Phase 3 will take approximately 60 seconds to kill Unsock, leaving the raid with about 5 minutes of potential time for Phase 2. Consider all the DPS that must be dealt to various targets during this phase. So constructs have 8.6 million hit points. Consuming a puddle or a pool adds another 2 million hit points for the construct. Living Ambers each have 759,000 health. And of course the Monstrosity itself has 109 million hit points base. Since Reshape Life and Amber Scalpel are cast every 50 seconds, thus creating a new construct for Living Ambers and for eventual pools to be consumed, we can calculate the approximate DPS required to deal all the necessary damage in Phase 2 in our approximate 5-minute allotment as follows. To calculate the DPS required for construct management, which includes the Living Ambers and construct heals, we basically have 4 heals that will occur for 2 million each, plus 8.6 million baseline health. And then we only have to do 80% of that damage to get them at the 20% mark where they can escape. And then there's also 4 Living Amber at 759 each. And so add all that up, divide by 50 seconds, and we get 326,320 total construct DPS to deal with just those. And then on top of that, we also have the Monstrosity's health. So 109 million over our 300 seconds for the total phase time gives another 363,000 DPS. So total required is 689,000 DPS to kill the Monstrosity in 5 minutes time. Now keep in mind that this DPS requirement is for all targets in total. Damage, of course, can be compartmentalized such that it's more efficient. So perhaps 1 or 2 people killing Living Amber spawns, 2 or 3 people on the construct, and 2 or 3 on the Monstrosity full time. It must also be remembered that invariably 1 DPS will be contributing virtually no damage throughout most of the phase, as he or she will be within a construct and therefore dealing no damage due to Amber Strikes on Unsock, who's immune. However, sometimes a healer can be the construct target, but if you're using 2 healers and 6 DPS, which is standard, then obviously 3/4 of the time DPS players will be constructed during this phase. The only other tricky part to this strategy is properly interrupting the Monstrosity's Amber Explosion while most Amber Strikes are being applied to Unsock instead. So similar to managing the interrupt when attacking the Monstrosity primarily, this method requires just a bit of planning based on the Monstrosity's Amber Explosion cooldown. So first, while Amber Explosion cooldown has greater than 20 seconds remaining, you can Amber Strike on Unsock on cooldown just like normal. When Amber Explosion is between 13 and 20 seconds before it's cast, then you should use Amber Strike on Unsock 1 more time anywhere within that window, and then halt and prepare for the final strike. Third step is once the Amber Explosion has as close to 6 seconds as possible remaining on the cooldown, use Amber Strike on Unsock 1 last time. During this cooldown for Amber Strike, now establish target on the Monstrosity and get in position. The moment the Amber Explosion is cast, Amber Strike on Monstrosity to interrupt it, and then retarget and reposition on Unsock. So, while it is close, this method will give you about a 2 to 3 second margin of error to reapply Destabilize on Unsock before the stack expires. So, this strategy is a great way to get into the fight deeper and see how things work on mechanics, but the DPS requirement is quite severe. Due to the control allowed to the raid, there will be very little during both Phase 1 and Phase 2 that can be considered dangerous. For this reason, and to assist with the DPS requirement, it's highly advisable to utilize a 1 healer method with this strategy. With proper raid cooldowns from the solo healer, hybrids, and the tanks, for the final Phase 3 damage, survival should be reasonable at the end. The only danger to 1 healer is if the healer becomes a construct during Phase 2, at which point tanks should blow cooldowns and self-heal, while a similar cooldown should be used on the active Parasitic Growth target if possible. So the second strategy sustained tank construct and destabilizing unsock presents a number of potential challenges and takes some practice to properly manage all the timings. However, this strategy makes a trade-off between lowering required raid DPS to instead greatly increase the healing requirements and slightly increase the construct difficulty for a single designated player. The basic goal is simple. Maintain a sustained destabilize stack on unsock throughout the encounter so that phase 3 is very short, but do so by allowing a single tank to remain within his or her construct throughout all of phase 2 in order to easily sustain the destabilize stack on unsock. This is done by saving up or banking a number of living amber spawns that are not consumed during phase 1. The number that must be banked or saved is based on the raid DPS, and thus how long the monstrosity will take to kill and finish phase 2. However, since this strategy doesn't inherently keep destabilized stacks on the monstrosity, it will require a large number of banked living ambers to be saved, probably 16 or more. Experimentation will be necessary, of course, to see how many your raid needs. During phase 1 with this method, the tanks should take turns while constructed to consume all pools that are active until the raid needs to start saving up living amber. Once the saving begins, each tank must consume only one pool during his or her construct phase, which will give them enough energy and time to be able to keep Destabilize active long enough on unsock for the next tank to refresh the stack when she becomes constructed. Living ambers should continue to be killed as they spawn, either fresh spawns from the scalpel or respawns, as the damage they deal will add up quickly. Once enough living amber are saved up, the raid should push unsock over 70% and transition into phase 2 when Reshape Life has about 30 to 40 seconds remaining on the cooldown. If you do it any later or any sooner, eventually the timings of Reshape Life during phase 2 will not line up properly with the monstrosity's amber explosion, meaning an interrupt will be impossible. Meanwhile, the tank that has a construct going into phase 2 remains a construct for the rest of the fight. This player is the only construct allowed to consume pools, and otherwise he or she will focus solely on keeping Destabilize stacked on unsock in preparation for phase 3, while the rest of the raid deals with the new construct players and kills off living amber for the tank to consume. The other big change with this strategy is since one tank is a construct full-time, when the monstrosity uses grab and fling to throw the current tank on a random raid member, it causes the monstrosity to lose threat temporarily for about 5 or 6 seconds and attack the next highest threat target. There are a variety of methods to deal with this, but the safest is to have a taunt-capable player just taunt the monstrosity as soon as grab is cast, forcing the monstrosity to melee attack that player for 3 or 4 swings until the primary player can retaunt. Unsock, however, retains his threat on the flung tank and therefore is not a big deal. The best thing about this method is that in addition to not requiring very high DPS to meet the requirement and allowing a high destabilize stack on unsock for phase 3, for the majority of the raid, this strategy is almost identical to how normal difficulty is handled. So all normal phase 2 Reshape Life targets should focus solely on attacking the monstrosity, and they never need worry about consuming pools or doing anything other than amber striking the monstrosity and interrupting the monstrosity's amber explosion cast. The drawback to this method is the sheer number of amber that must be saved during phase 1 to allow the tank construct to remain active full time. Also, remember, you can't simply let the tank die and res to fix the issue, since the construct remains active if someone dies within it, and it will have a ton of health from all the consuming that occurred prior. So, to alleviate this issue of practicing this method, find opportunities to focus DPS on the monstrosity as much as possible. Assign only a handful of DPS to deal with living ambers and non-tank construct killing if you can. Non-tank constructs should also focus on getting the destabilized stack as high as possible on the monstrosity while they're active. 6 destabilized stacks should be possible during a single construct lifespan. So finally, the strategy that our raid eventually settled on is basically identical to strategy 2, except it requires a much greater difficulty for the tank construct. But, on the other hand, it also reduces the healing requirement, DPS requirement, and the number of necessary saved living ambers. Performing this strategy is much like strategy 2. During phase 1, tanks consume all pools until we're ready to start saving up living amber. With our DPS, we found that saving up 10 living amber was a reasonable number. This meant that the process of savings starts around 3 amber scalpels before we're ready to push into phase 2. So on the first of these 3 scalpels, our tank consumes 1 pool to sustain Destabilize on Unsock. The second scalpel, the second tank does the same, drinking only 1 pool. And then finally, on the third scalpel, when our first tank becomes reshaped once again, we've got our 10 active living amber saved up, and we can push the boss into phase 2. Once into phase 2, the tank construct has the tricky job of sustaining Destabilize on both Amber Shaper and the Monstrosity. With a 6-second cooldown of Amber Strike and Destabilize lasting 15 seconds, this means there is a 3-second margin of error or window where the player can not cast Amber Strike even when it's available off cooldown. This gap is large enough to easily maintain both stacks throughout, but the tank construct must be very mindful to use Amber Strike on cooldown and use the time spans between Amber Strike cooldowns to run out to consume pools between about every other Amber Strike cast. They'll average about 1 pool every 12.5 seconds. As with strategy 2, any strategy that allows a single player to remain a construct and handle Destabilize on Unsock makes the construct management for the rest of the raid very simple. Moreover, by keeping the Destabilize stack climbing on the Monstrosity, phase 2 will go by extremely quickly, and again, Unsock will have a high Destabilize stack as well entering phase 3, allowing you to burn them down very fast. Now, as mentioned, this method requires the tank construct to juggle Destabilize between 2 targets, which can obviously be very tricky and takes practice. Macros to help targeting or casting on the 2 bosses can be quite useful. Additionally, when fling occurs, it will force Unsock to run off and chase the boss tank to whatever their target destination is. This movement must be watched closely by the tank construct and planned around so that the boss target does not get out of melee range accidentally when Amber Strike is available and should be used. To help alleviate this, we found it best to keep most of the raid near the central indentation area of the room so that travel distance would be minimized for the tank construct no matter what. Our boss tank also tries to keep the boss in the very center of the room at all times to assist with this as well. All right, so I think that covers everything that is Amber Shaper Unsock Heroic. It's a pretty challenging fight, so just spend some time practicing the construct management and timings, and eventually you'll make progress and get it down. Good luck, and thanks for watching.